At a wedding so lavish it dripped with gold and smelled of money, a quiet black woman in a simple navy dress stood out. She wasn't meant to. She was meant to blend in, to observe, to be just another face in the crowd. But she was treated as if she didn't belong at all. The bride, a vision in white lace and entitlement, pointed a perfectly manicured finger at her voice a cruel whip cracking through the elegant music. She humiliated the woman in front of hundreds of guests, kicking her out of her own seat to make room for a white friend who, in her eyes, fit the picture better. But the nobody she had just cast aside, the woman she saw as less than, was no nobody at all. She was the billionaire CEO whose name was on the dotted line of a $120 million deal. A deal that was meant to fund the groom's entire company, to secure their perfect, golden future. By the end of this night, after the champagne had gone flat and the flowers had begun to wilt, that bride would be on her knees begging for forgiveness. But it would be far, far too late. Before we find out what happens next, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story already has your jaw dropping, hit that like button now. The ballroom of the Grand Oak Manor was a fairy tale brought to life. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, glittering light over hundreds of guests dressed in their finest. The air hummed with the gentle melody of a string quartet, the clinking of champagne flutes, and the soft murmur of polite laughter. It was the perfect picture of wealth and happiness, a carefully constructed illusion that was about to be shattered. The silence came first, a sudden, sharp intake of breath that rippled through the nearest tables, spreading like a crack in thin ice. All eyes turned toward the source of the disruption, the bride herself, Madison Lane. Madison, a vision of shimmering white lace and diamonds, stood over a table near the back of the room. Her smile, which had been plastered on her face for hours of photographs, was gone. In its place was a tight, ugly sneer. Her target was a woman seated alone, a black woman in a modest but elegant navy dress named Danielle Carter. Danielle had been quietly observing the room, her expression calm and thoughtful, a small, untouched glass of water in front of her. "Excuse me." Madison's voice was not a whisper. It was a declaration, loud enough to make heads turn and conversations die. "I don't remember inviting you." The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. The guests at the surrounding tables froze, forks halfway to their mouths. They exchanged nervous glances, unsure of how to react. This was not part of the carefully choreographed celebration. Danielle looked up, her gaze steady. There was no flicker of fear or embarrassment in her eyes, only a quiet patience. "I believe you did," she replied, her voice soft but clear. "Your husband, Ethan, sent me the invitation, personally." She reached for her small clutch on the table, took out her phone, and tapped the screen. A digital invitation, complete with the elegant script of their names, glowed on the display. She held it up for Madison to see. Madison's lip curled in a dismissive scoff. She didn't even glance at the name on the invitation. She saw only what she wanted to see, a woman who didn't fit her vision of a perfect, exclusive wedding. A woman who didn't look like her other friends, with their designer dresses and loud, confident laughter. She snatched the phone from Danielle's hand, her movement sharp and aggressive. The guests gasped audibly this time. "Anyone could have faked this," Madison said, waving the phone dismissively before dropping it back onto the table with a clatter. She then lifted her chin and waved a hand in the air, a queen summoning her guards. "Security!" she called out, her voice ringing with authority. "We have an uninvited guest who needs to be removed." Two large men in dark suits who had been standing discreetly by the main doors began to walk toward the table. They moved slowly, their expressions unreadable but tinged with a clear discomfort. They could sense the tension in the room, the 100 pairs of eyes watching them. This was not a belligerent, drunken guest causing a scene. This was a calm, composed woman being targeted by the bride. Madison turned her attention back to Danielle, her eyes cold and hard. "We have very important people here tonight," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. We don't have room for randoms, especially not ones like this. The last word was loaded with a meaning that everyone in the room understood. It was a poisoned dart aimed directly at Danielle's race, her simple dress, her quiet presence. A chilling stillness fell over Danielle. She didn't flinch. She simply absorbed the insult, her face a mask of dignified composure. The security guards arrived at the table, their large frames casting a shadow over the scene. One of them cleared his throat, looking from the furious bride to the silent guest. "Ma'am," he began, addressing Madison, "is there a problem?" "The problem," Madison snapped, "is that this woman is trespassing. I want her out. Now." Her insistence was absolute. She would not be questioned. Danielle slowly rose from her chair. She didn't argue. She didn't plead. She met the uncomfortable gazes of the other guests, some of whom looked away in shame, others who watched with a sort of morbid fascination. She gathered her small clutch and her phone from the table. Her movements were deliberate, unhurried, as if she were the one in control of the situation, not the bride. She was a picture of grace under fire, a silent rebuke to Madison's loud, vulgar display of power. She turned to leave, the two security guards flanking her like a prisoner's escort. As she walked toward the grand double doors, a path cleared for her through the sea of guests. The silence was deafening, broken only by the soft rustle of her dress and the distant, oblivious melody of the string quartet. Just as she reached the exit, a young waitress named Evelyn Brooks, who had been standing nearby with a tray of empty glasses, stepped forward. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and sympathy. She leaned in close to Danielle, her voice a barely audible whisper. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "That was wrong. So wrong." Danielle paused and looked at the young woman. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. It was a smile of acknowledgement, of understanding. "It's all right," she replied, her voice just as quiet. "People always show you who they really are, one way or another." With those final, cryptic words, she turned and walked out of the ballroom, leaving behind a room full of stunned silence and a bride who believed she had just won a great victory. But something in Danielle's calm departure and the quiet finality of her tone suggested this story was very, very far from over. Inside the ballroom, the shock wave of Danielle's exit slowly subsided, replaced by a nervous buzz of whispers. Madison, however, was riding a wave of triumph. A rush of petty power coursed through her veins. She had identified a problem, an element that didn't belong in her perfect picture, and she had removed it. She felt strong, decisive. She turned to her bridesmaids, who were gathered nearby with wide, uncertain eyes, and let out a triumphant little laugh. "Problem solved," she announced, smoothing down the front of her expensive gown. Her voice was bright, almost giddy. "Honestly, some people have no shame, just showing up where they're not wanted." She took a sip of champagne from a glass one of her friends offered her. The cool liquid seemed to fortify her sense of self-righteousness. "I had to replace her seat with Savannah's, of course. At least she looks like she belongs here." Savannah, a blonde woman in a glittering gold dress, beamed at the compliment. Some of the guests at the nearby tables offered weak, hesitant chuckles. They were laughing not because they found it funny, but because it was easier than confronting the bride on her wedding day. It was easier to go along with the cruelty than to challenge it. The path of least resistance was a well-trodden one in their social circle. Just then, Ethan Brooks, the groom, made his way through the crowd. His face was a mask of confusion and concern. He had seen the commotion from across the room while talking to a business associate. "Maddie, what was all that about?" he asked, his voice low. "I saw security walk someone out. Where's Danielle Carter?" "I've been looking for her. I invited her personally." Madison waved a dismissive hand, her diamond rings flashing under the chandeliers. "Oh, don't worry about it, sweetie. It was just some woman who crashed the party. She was sitting in the seat I saved for Savannah. I handled it." She gave him a peck on the cheek, a gesture meant to end the conversation. Ethan's face paled slightly. What woman? What did she look like? A knot of anxiety began to form in his stomach. Danielle Carter was not just any guest. She was the guest. The one person whose presence was more important than anyone else's in the room, including his own family. I don't know, Ethan, Madison said with a sigh of exasperation, her patience wearing thin. Black woman, plain blue dress. Looked like she got lost on her way to a church service. It doesn't matter. She's gone now. The color drained from Ethan's face. Madison. No. The words were a horrified whisper. But before he could say more, before he could explain the catastrophic mistake his new wife had just made, the wedding photographer appeared at his elbow. Ethan, Madison, we need you for the cake-cutting photos right now, the photographer chirped, oblivious to the unfolding disaster. Madison, delighted to be the center of attention again, grabbed Ethan's arm and pulled him away. Come on, honey, she cooed. Let's go cut the cake. Ethan allowed himself to be led away, his mind reeling. He cast a frantic look back at the now empty table where Danielle Carter was supposed to be sitting. His heart pounded in his chest. He tried to tell himself that it must have been a misunderstanding. It couldn't have been the Danielle Carter. She wouldn't have come dressed so simply. She would have been surrounded by an entourage. But deep down, a cold dread was beginning to seep into his bones. He knew Danielle Carter was known for her low-key approach. He had just married a woman who had, in a single act of snobbery, potentially destroyed his entire future. Meanwhile, unnoticed by the celebrating bride and the panicking groom, Evelyn the waitress was finishing her shift. The image of the calm woman being escorted out, the bride's cruel words echoing in her ears, had deeply disturbed her. It wasn't just rude, it was ugly. It was an abuse of power that turned her stomach. On instinct, as Madison was preening to her bridesmaids after the incident, Evelyn had discreetly taken out her phone. Hiding it behind the tray she was carrying, she had recorded a short video. It captured Madison laughing, saying, I replaced her seat with Savannah. At least she looks like she belongs. It wasn't much, but it was proof. Proof of the casual cruelty she had just witnessed. Outside the grand venue, beyond the sounds of laughter and music, Danielle Carter was not angry. She was not hurt. She was assessing. She stood for a moment under the cool night sky, the gentle breeze a welcome relief from the stuffy ballroom. The humiliation was a familiar sting, one she had felt many times on her long climb to the top. It no longer had the power to wound her, only to inform her. She took out her phone, the same one Madison had so contemptuously dropped on the table, and made a quiet call. It was not to her board chair, not yet. That call would come later. This one was to her head of security. James, she said, her voice perfectly level. Change of plans. The observation phase is over. I've seen everything I need to see. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Pull up everything you have on the internal culture of Blue Thread AI. I want to see employee satisfaction reports, exit interviews, any complaints filed. Focus on the leadership. I have a feeling the fish rots from the head down. She listened for a moment, then nodded to herself. Thank you. She ended the call and looked back at the glowing windows of the Grand Oak Manor. Inside, Madison was celebrating her victory. She had no idea she had just declared war on a titan. To understand the sheer scale of the mistake Madison Lane had just made, you had to understand who Danielle Carter really was. To the guests at the wedding, she was an anonymous face, a nobody in a plain dress. In the world of global business, however, Danielle Carter was a giant. She was the founder and CEO of Carter Innovations, a clean technology empire that had revolutionized energy systems across the globe. Her personal net worth was estimated at $3.2 billion. She wasn't just rich, she was a force of nature who had built her empire from the absolute ground up. Her story was the stuff of legends, whispered in awe in boardrooms from Silicon Valley to Shanghai. She hadn't been born into wealth or privilege. She had started her career as a janitor, working the night shift at a large tech corporation. While others saw drudgery, Danielle saw opportunity. Mopping the floors of server rooms and research labs, she began to notice the incredible amount of energy being wasted, the inefficient cooling systems, the outdated power grids. She read discarded manuals, taught herself engineering principles from textbooks she borrowed from the library, and began sketching out her own ideas in a worn-out notebook during her breaks. She developed a prototype for a new kind of energy management system in her own small apartment, using salvaged parts and a will of iron. The system was so revolutionary, so efficient, that when she finally got a chance to present it to a low-level manager at the company where she worked, it sent shockwaves up the corporate ladder. Within 5 years, she had founded Carter Innovations. Within 10, she was a billionaire. She had outthought, outworked, and outmaneuvered every competitor who had underestimated the quiet woman who had once pushed a broom. Ethan Brooks' startup, Blue Thread AI, was the latest company to catch her discerning eye. His team had developed a promising artificial intelligence platform that could dramatically improve the efficiency of large-scale power grids, a perfect complement to Carter Innovations hardware. After months of rigorous vetting and financial analysis, Blue Thread AI had been shortlisted for a strategic investment. The number on the table was $120 million. It was an amount that would not only secure Blue Thread's future, but would make it a major player in the tech industry overnight. It would make Ethan a multimillionaire CEO, and by extension, would give Madison the life of effortless luxury she so desperately craved. But for Danielle, the numbers on a balance sheet were only part of the story. She had learned a long time ago that a company's success was inextricably linked to its culture, to the character of its leaders. She refused to invest in companies run by people who lacked integrity, no matter how brilliant their technology. It was a principle that had served her well, saving her from countless bad deals and toxic partnerships. A week before the wedding, she had sat down with her chief financial officer, a sharp, no-nonsense man named Marcus Thorne. He had pushed for the Blue Thread deal, convinced of its financial upside. "The tech is solid, Danielle," he'd argued, pointing to a chart of projected growth. "It's a guaranteed home run." Danielle had leaned back in her chair, her gaze thoughtful. "The tech may be solid, Marcus, but what about the people? What about the founder, this Ethan Brooks?" "He's young, ambitious, brilliant," Marcus had replied. "Checks all the boxes." "I'm not talking about boxes," Danielle had said softly. "I'm talking about character. I've been invited to his wedding. I'm going to go. Not as the CEO of Carter Innovations, just as a guest. I want to see him in his own environment. I want to see how he treats people when he thinks no one important is watching. I need to know," she had finished, her voice firm, "if I'm funding people who value integrity, not just profit." Marcus had been skeptical, but he knew better than to argue with Danielle when she had that look in her eye. He had agreed, never imagining what she would discover. Now, standing outside the wedding venue, the cool night air on her face, Danielle had her answer. What she had witnessed tonight, the casual cruelty, the public humiliation, the snobbery masquerading as exclusivity, had told her more than any board report or financial projection ever could. She had come to the wedding to observe the character of the man she was about to make incredibly wealthy. And in the ugliest, most undeniable way possible, his new wife had shown her exactly what that character was worth. The foundation of the $120 million deal was not built on solid ground. It was built on sand, and the tide was about to come in. Evelyn Brooks stacked the last of the dirty plates onto her tray, her hands moving on autopilot. Her mind, however, was replaying the scene with Danielle Carter over and over. The bride's sneering face, the woman's quiet dignity, the uncomfortable silence of the guests. It had left a sour taste in her mouth. She had been working events like this for 3 years to pay her way through community college, and she had seen her fair share of entitled behavior. But this was different. It wasn't just a rude guest or a demanding host. It was a public shaming, and it felt personal. It felt wrong on a fundamental level. She couldn't shake the image of the woman walking out alone. On a sudden impulse, Evelyn dropped off her tray in the kitchen, told her supervisor she was taking her 10-minute break, and slipped out a side door. She scanned the manicured grounds of the manor and saw a lone figure standing near the edge of the parking lot, bathed in the soft glow of a lamppost. It was her. Taking a deep breath, Evelyn walked over. "Ma'am," she said softly, not wanting to startle her. Danielle turned, her expression calm and unreadable. I wanted to apologize again," Evelyn said, her words tumbling out. What Madison did was horrible. No one deserves to be treated like that." Danielle offered a small, genuine smile. "Thank you, Evelyn. That's very kind of you. It's not your apology to give." "I know, but I work here. I feel like I'm a part of it somehow," Evelyn confessed, wringing her hands slightly. "And I can't stand people like her. People who think they're better than everyone else." Danielle's gaze was sharp, intelligent. She seemed to be studying Evelyn, looking past the simple black-and-white uniform to the person underneath. "You know them well? The bride and groom?" she asked, her tone gentle and inquisitive. Evelyn nodded. "I've worked a few events for Madison's family before. She's always been like that, dismissive, especially to the staff or to anyone she thinks is beneath her. She's complained about the caterers, the valets, the cleaning crew. She treats people like they're invisible until she needs something, and then she's just demanding." "And the groom? Ethan?" Danielle asked, her voice remaining carefully neutral. Evelyn hesitated for a moment. "He's different," she admitted. "He seems kind, usually. He'll say thank you, make eye contact. He's not like her, but—" She trailed off, searching for the right words. "But he lets her get away with it. He never stands up to her, not really. It's like he's so focused on his business and his goals that he just tunes out how awful she can be to other people." Danielle absorbed this information, a thoughtful expression on her face. What Evelyn was describing was a familiar pattern. The brilliant but morally passive man enabling the toxic behavior of his partner. It was a weakness of character, just a different kind from Madison's overt cruelty. "I just don't want people like that to win," Evelyn said, a sudden passion in her voice. "It's not fair. They get to have this huge, fancy wedding and treat people like garbage, and then they'll go on to have their perfect, rich life. It just feels wrong." Danielle nodded slowly, a flicker of something new in her eyes. It was respect. "Neither do I, Evelyn," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Neither do I." A moment of silence passed between them, a sense of shared understanding. Then Danielle's expression became more serious. "You said you saw what happened. You were standing quite close." "Yes, ma'am. I saw the whole thing." "I noticed you had your phone out afterward when Madison was talking to her friends," Danielle stated, her observations so precise it almost startled Evelyn. Evelyn's eyes widened slightly. She hadn't thought anyone had noticed. Yes, I recorded a little bit of it. I don't even know why. I guess I just felt like someone needed to have a record of it, of what she said." Danielle's gaze intensified. "Evelyn, would you be willing to share that recording with me if it becomes necessary?" The question hung in the air. Sharing the video could get her fired. Her boss had a strict no-phones policy during events. It could cause a lot of trouble. But then she thought of Danielle's calm face as she was being forced to leave. She thought of Madison's triumphant smirk, and the choice became very simple. "Yes," Evelyn said without a moment of hesitation. "Absolutely. I'll send it to you right now." She took out her phone, her fingers flying across the screen as she found the video and airdropped it to Danielle's device. A small chime confirmed the transfer. A quiet alliance had been formed under the dim light of a parking lot lamppost. An alliance between a billionaire CEO in a simple navy dress and a college student waitress in a black and white uniform. Both of them were invisible to people like Madison Lane. And that was about to become Madison's biggest mistake. Danielle looked at the determined young woman in front of her and saw something she valued more than any patent or stock certificate. Integrity. Back inside the glittering ballroom, Madison Lane was on top of the world. The unpleasantness with the uninvited guest was a distant memory, a minor footnote in the grand story of her perfect day. She floated through the room, a glass of champagne permanently attached to her hand, soaking in the adoration and envy of her guests. She felt powerful, untouchable. She was now Mrs. Ethan Brooks, wife of a soon-to-be tech mogul. Her future was a straight, shining line to the very top of the social ladder. She found her circle of bridesmaids gathered near the towering seven-tiered wedding cake. "Did you see that?" she bragged, her voice a loud whisper that was meant to be overheard. "The nerve of some people. You have to be firm. You have to teach them a lesson, or they'll walk all over you." One of her bridesmaids, a woman named Chloe, who seemed to possess a sliver of common sense, looked a little nervous. "Maddie, are you sure that was a good idea? Kicking her out so publicly? What if she complains or posts something online?" Madison let out a sharp, derisive laugh. It was a sound like breaking glass. "Complain to who?" she scoffed, taking a delicate sip of her champagne. "The manager. He knows my father pays for half the events in this place. Post it online? Please. Who's going to believe some random woman over me? Over the bride?" She gestured around the opulent room at the ice sculptures and the mountains of flowers. "Look at this place. Look at me. I'm about to be married to a CEO, a millionaire. What is she? A nobody. Her opinion is worthless." The other bridesmaids giggled and nodded in agreement, their loyalty bought and paid for with expensive dresses and a prominent spot in the wedding photos. Chloe still looked uneasy, but she didn't press the issue. It was Madison's day, and no one was going to challenge the Queen on her coronation night. The key to Madison's breathtaking arrogance was her complete and utter ignorance. She didn't know Danielle's name. When Ethan had tried to tell her he had invited a very important potential investor named Danielle Carter, the name had gone in one ear and out the other. To Madison, names and details only mattered if they were attached to people she deemed important. People with recognizable last names, people featured in society magazines, people who could do something for her. Danielle Carter, in her simple dress and quiet demeanor, had not registered on her social radar. She had been categorized and dismissed in a single glance. And so she continued her victory lap, completely unaware of the invisible threads of consequence that were already beginning to tighten around her. She didn't know that her cruel words, the very ones she was now so proud of, had been recorded. She didn't know that the nobody she had mocked was one of the wealthiest and most powerful self-made women in America. She certainly didn't know that this woman held the fate of her new husband's company, and by extension, her entire future, in the palm of her hand. Her arrogance grew with every toast, with every compliment on her dress, with every passing hour. She felt invincible. She posed for more photos, her smile wide and bright, a perfect picture of bridal bliss. She laughed with Ethan's business partners, charming them with practiced ease, imagining the future dinner parties and charity galas she would host. She was already spending the $120 million in her head, decorating a new mansion, planning lavish vacations, designing a life worthy of her. The trap was closing around her, and she was the one merrily skipping into it, convinced it was a red carpet rolled out just for her. The higher she climbed on her pedestal of pride, the further she would have to fall. And the fall was coming much sooner than she could ever imagine. The wedding reception wound down in the early hours of the morning. The music faded, the guests began to depart in a fleet of luxury cars. And the grand ballroom started to look a little less magical, and a little more like a messy, expensive party that was over. Danielle Carter had been gone for hours. She hadn't gone home to her sprawling penthouse apartment. Instead, she had directed her driver to take her to a quiet, discreet location. A small, 24-hour cafe on the other side of town. A place she sometimes went to think without the distractions of her corporate world. She sat in a simple booth, a cup of black coffee untouched in front of her. Her town car, a sleek but unmarked sedan, was parked outside, its tinted windows hiding the driver who waited patiently. For a long time she just sat there, replaying the events of the evening in her mind. She analyzed Madison's words, Ethan's passive compliance, and Evelyn's quiet courage. It was like looking at a complex equation. Every action, every word, every choice was a variable that led to a single, inevitable conclusion. Finally, she took out her phone. The screen cast a cool blue light on her face. She scrolled through her contacts, past the names of world leaders and industry titans, until she found the one she was looking for, David Chen, the chairman of her board. He was a wise, older man who had been with her since the early days, one of the few people she trusted implicitly. She knew he would be asleep, but she also knew he would understand the urgency. She pressed the call button. He answered on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep, but instantly alert. "Danielle, is everything all right?" "I'm fine, David," she said, her voice a calm, steady line in the quiet cafe. "I'm sorry to wake you, but this can't wait until morning." "What is it? What's happened?" he asked, the concern in his voice evident. Danielle took a slow, deliberate sip of her coffee. It was cold. "Pause the Blue Thread acquisition," she said. The words were simple, direct, and carried the weight of $120 million. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. David was not a man who was easily surprised. "Pause it? Danielle, the final papers are ready to be signed on Monday. What happened? Did you find something in the financials, a hidden liability?" "Nothing like that," Danielle replied. "The numbers are fine, the technology is fine." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "I attended the founder's wedding tonight. I met the people we would be backing." David waited, knowing there was more. "And I will not bankroll that level of arrogance and prejudice," she stated, her voice hardening with a quiet, unshakable resolve. "I will not attach the Carter Innovations name to people who treat others with such blatant disrespect. The deal is off. We are canceling the $120 million offer. Permanently." Another silence, this one longer. David knew Danielle. He knew her principles were the bedrock of their company. He had seen her walk away from profitable deals before over ethical concerns, but never one this large, this late in the game. He also knew that her instincts were almost never wrong. "All right, Danielle," he said finally, his voice now crisp and professional. "I'll make the calls first thing. I'll draft the official notice of withdrawal. The board will need a full explanation." "You'll have it," she said, "along with a video that will explain everything you need to know." She thought of Evelyn, the young waitress who had chosen to do the right thing. "And David," she added, a new idea taking shape in her mind. "Start the paperwork to establish a new scholarship fund, a full ride plus a leadership internship at the company. I've found our first recipient." With that single quiet phone call in a cheap all-night cafe, a storm had been set in motion. As Danielle ended the call, she could almost hear the gears of her massive corporation begin to turn. Emails would be sent with urgent subject lines. Virtual meetings would be scheduled across time zones. Lawyers would begin drafting new documents. And across town, Ethan and Madison Brooks, sleeping soundly in their honeymoon suite, had no idea that the world they had woken up to was about to be tilted completely off its axis. Their golden future had just been canceled. 3 days passed. For Madison and Ethan Brooks, they were a blissful champagne-soaked haze. They had spent their mini honeymoon at a luxurious spa resort, blissfully unaware of the corporate earthquake rumbling beneath their feet. Madison had spent the time posting perfectly curated photos of their wedding to social media, basking in the flood of likes and congratulatory comments. Ethan had tried to push the nagging worry about Danielle Carter to the back of his mind. He had called her office twice, leaving polite messages with her assistant, but had received no reply. He told himself she was simply busy. A woman like that didn't have time to respond to every wedding guest. He chose to believe that his wife's outburst had gone unnoticed, or at least had been deemed unimportant. On the third day, an email arrived in Ethan's inbox. The subject line read, "Urgent, Final Due Diligence Meeting. Carter Innovations and Blue Thread AI." The body of the email was brief and formal, requesting his and Madison's presence at the Carter Innovations corporate headquarters the following morning at 10 o'clock sharp. Ethan felt a surge of relief. This was it, the final step. They were going to sign the papers and finalize the deal. His anxiety melted away, replaced by a giddy excitement. "Maddie, look at this," he called out, showing her his phone. "We're meeting at Carter Innovations tomorrow. This is the big one." Madison glanced at the email, a smug smile spreading across her face. "Of course it is," she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. To her, this was just a formality, a final victory lap. It was a chance for her to see the inside of the legendary Carter Innovations Tower, to be formally welcomed into the world of the ultra-wealthy. She immediately began planning her outfit, something that would scream, "wife of a tech mogul." She saw the meeting not as a business requirement, but as her grand debut into high society. Ethan, on the other hand, felt a small, persistent flicker of nervousness. Why had they specifically requested Madison's presence? Due diligence meetings were typically for founders and key executives. And why had Danielle been so silent since the wedding? He pushed the thoughts aside. He couldn't afford to be negative. Everything he had ever worked for was about to come to fruition. The next morning, they walked into the lobby of the Carter Innovations Tower. It was a masterpiece of modern architecture, all glass and steel and soaring open spaces. The air itself seemed to hum with power and innovation. They were greeted by a stern-faced assistant, who led them silently through a maze of pristine corridors to a large boardroom on the top floor. The room was intimidating. A long, polished mahogany table dominated the space, surrounded by 24 empty leather chairs. One entire wall was a floor-to-ceiling window, offering a breathtaking panoramic view of the city below. The air was heavy, clinical, and cold. Danielle Carter was not there. Instead, two stone-faced board members, a man and a woman in their late 50s, were seated at the far end of the table. They nodded curtly as Ethan and Madison entered, but did not smile. And seated quietly beside them, in a simple but professional-looking blouse, was a young woman. Madison squinted, a flicker of confusion on her face. The woman looked familiar. Then recognition dawned, and her expression soured into one of pure contempt. "What is she doing here?" Madison scoffed, her voice echoing in the silent room. She pointed an indignant finger. "She's the waitress from our wedding." It was Evelyn Brooks. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded neatly on the table in front of her. She met Madison's furious gaze not with fear, but with a quiet, unwavering confidence. Ethan froze, his heart beginning to pound a frantic, heavy rhythm against his ribs. This was wrong. This was all terribly, horribly wrong. Why was a waitress from his wedding sitting at the table in a $120 million deal meeting? The knot of dread in his stomach, the one he had been ignoring for 3 days, tightened into a cold, hard stone. The trap was about to be sprung. Just as Madison opened her mouth to say something else, to demand an explanation for the presence of a mere serving girl, the grand double doors at the end of the boardroom swung open. The sound was soft, but it carried the weight of a thunderclap in the tense, silent room. Danielle Carter entered. She was not the same woman from the wedding. The modest navy dress was gone. In its place was a flawlessly tailored charcoal gray power suit that radiated authority. Her hair was styled immaculately, and her walk was one of quiet, absolute command. She was flanked by two sharp-looking executives, her CFO, Marcus Thorne, and her chief legal counsel. They moved like a phalanx, with Danielle at the undisputed center of power. Madison's jaw literally dropped. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. A choked, gurgling sound was all she could manage. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin a pasty, sickly white. The woman from the wedding, the random she had kicked out. It couldn't be. Her mind refused to process what her eyes were seeing. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with horrifying speed and clarity. The important investor Ethan had mentioned. The name on the invitation she hadn't bothered to read. The polite, unshakable calm of the woman she had publicly humiliated. Ethan turned a shade paler than his wife. He looked as though he had been punched in the stomach. The air left his lungs in a silent whoosh. "Oh my God," he whispered, the words barely audible. His entire body went cold. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. He had known deep down that this was a possibility, but he had prayed he was wrong. He wasn't. The disaster was real, and it was standing right in front of him. Danielle walked to the head of the long table and took her seat. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her presence alone commanded the complete attention of everyone in the room. She looked directly at Madison, then at Ethan, her gaze level and piercing. The calm patience was still there, but now it was backed by the undeniable force of billions of dollars and absolute control. "Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. Brooks," she said, her voice smooth and even, yet carrying a chilling edge. "Thank you for coming. For those of you who may be confused, allow me to reintroduce myself." She paused for a beat, letting the weight of the moment settle over them. "My name is Danielle Carter. I am the founder and CEO of Carter Innovations." She let her eyes lock onto Madison's. "I was also the random guest you had removed from your wedding 3 nights ago." An absolute crushing silence fell over the boardroom. It was so quiet that the frantic, panicked beat of Madison's heart felt like a drum in her own ears. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. Her world, which had seemed so bright and perfect just moments before, was collapsing into a black hole of her own making. Danielle gestured to one of her aides. "If we could dim the lights, please." The room darkened slightly, and a large screen on the wall flickered to life. "I believe there are some details from that evening that are pertinent to our final decision." With a click of a button, Evelyn's shaky cell phone video began to play. The audio was crystal clear. Madison's voice, giddy and cruel, filled the silent, hollowed boardroom. "I replaced her seat with Savannah," her recorded self chirped. "At least she looks like she belongs." The video ended. The screen went black. Madison's face, which was already pale, now seemed to drain of all life. The blood roared in her ears. Her own words, her own casual, ugly prejudice echoed in the space, a damning testament to her character. There was nowhere to run. There was nowhere to hide. The grand reveal was complete. Now came the judgment. The lights in the boardroom came back up, harsh and unforgiving. Danielle Carter's face was unreadable, her expression as polished and hard as the mahogany table she sat behind. She folded her hands in front of her, a picture of calm, collected power. Her voice, when she spoke, was not angry. It was far worse. It was disappointed. And it was final. "Carter Innovations," she began, her words precise and sharp, like a surgeon's scalpel, "was fully prepared to invest $120 million in Blue Thread AI. We believe in your technology, Mr. Brooks. We believed in its potential." She paused, letting the weight of that past tense hang in the air. "However, our investments are not based solely on technology. They are based on people. We invest in leaders. We invest in character." Her gaze shifted from Ethan to Madison, and it was like being pinned by a laser. "After witnessing the behavior at your wedding, after seeing the true character on display, we have made a decision." She didn't need to be dramatic. The facts were dramatic enough. "Effective immediately, Carter Innovations is officially withdrawing its offer. We have canceled the deal. My company, the company I built from nothing, will never ever fund bigotry, arrogance, or cruelty." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. $120 million. Gone. His company's future. Gone. His dreams. Gone. All of it, erased in an instant because of his wife's prejudice. A wave of fury and despair washed over him. He turned to Danielle, his voice pleading, desperate. "Please, Miss Carter. Danielle, please." He stammered, his hands outstretched as if to physically stop her decision from becoming real. "I had no idea. I swear to you, I didn't know it was you. This isn't who I am. This isn't what my company stands for. This was all her," he said, gesturing wildly at Madison, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and terror. "It was a horrible, horrible mistake, but it was her mistake, not mine." Danielle listened to his desperate plea without interruption. When he was finished, a deep, painful silence filled the room. Then she gave a slow, deliberate nod toward the young woman sitting at the table. "I know it's not what everyone stands for, Mr. Brooks. I met Evelyn that night." Her voice softened slightly when she said the waitress's name. "She showed me what integrity looks like. She saw an injustice, and she was not afraid to stand up for what was right, even at personal risk to herself." She turned her attention back to the stunned couple. "That is the kind of character I invest in. That is why, in lieu of funding your company, I have personally offered Ms. Evelyn Brooks a full 4-year scholarship to the university of her choice, to be funded by a new Carter Innovations grant. Upon her graduation, she will also have a guaranteed position in our leadership development program." Evelyn's eyes welled up with tears, but she blinked them back, sitting up even straighter. A small, grateful smile touched her lips. For Ethan and Madison, it was another devastating blow. Not only had they lost everything, but the serving girl they had dismissed and ignored was now being elevated, rewarded for the very integrity they so clearly lacked. Madison finally found her voice. It came out as a strangled, pathetic whimper. I'm sorry," she croaked, looking at Danielle, her eyes wide with panic. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know who you were. If I had known—" Danielle held up a hand, cutting her off instantly. Her voice turned to ice. "Stop," she said, the single word carrying more force than a shout. "That is the entire point. You disrespected me because you didn't know who I was. You humiliated a person you believed to be powerless, a person you thought couldn't hurt you. Character isn't how you treat the people you want to impress. It's not how you act around the powerful." She leaned forward slightly, her gaze locking onto Madison's, and delivered the final, crushing verdict. "Character is how you treat the person you think doesn't matter. And on that count, you failed. The meeting is over." The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. News of a 9-figure tech deal collapsing at the final hour travels fast in the business world. The official statement from Carter Innovations was brief and surgically precise. It simply said they had withdrawn their offer from Blue Thread AI following a final due diligence review that revealed a fundamental misalignment of corporate values. But the real story, the one with all the juicy, humiliating details, spread like wildfire. Whispers turned into rumors, and rumors turned into headlines. Someone who had been at the boardroom meeting leaked the details to a tech journalist. Then, somehow, Evelyn's video found its way online. The internet exploded. The headline was brutal and went viral instantly. "Bride's racist outburst costs husband's company a $120 million deal." The story was everywhere. It was on tech blogs, news sites, and every social media platform. Madison's carefully curated wedding photos were now plastered next to screenshots of her sneering face from Evelyn's video. She became a public symbol of entitlement and prejudice overnight. The comments were a tidal wave of condemnation, a digital mob tearing her to shreds. For Ethan, the consequences were just as swift and devastating. The collapse of the Carter Innovations deal was a signal to every other investor that something was deeply wrong with Blue Thread AI. His other backers, spooked by the public relations nightmare and the sudden loss of their lead investor, began to pull out. Calls for funding went unanswered. His company's valuation, which had been soaring just a week ago, plummeted to near zero. His employees, seeing the writing on the wall, started polishing their resumes. The company he had spent years building was disintegrating before his eyes. He was humiliated. He was furious with Madison, a deep, cold rage that had settled in his bones. But as the days turned into weeks and he was forced to lay off the last of his staff and sell off his company's assets for pennies on the dollar, a more painful realization began to dawn on him. Danielle Carter's judgment had been about character, and his had been found wanting too. He had known who Madison was. He had seen her casual cruelty for years, and had chosen to ignore it, to enable it, because it was easier. He had prioritized his ambition over his principles, and he had paid the ultimate price. It was a brutal, soul-crushing lesson, one he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Madison, meanwhile, retreated from the world. She deleted her social media accounts, but it was too late. The story was out there forever. Her friends, the same ones who had laughed at her cruel jokes at the wedding, now avoided her calls. She was no longer the wife of a promising CEO. She was a pariah, a viral villain. She locked herself in her apartment, stunned and speechless. The life she had so carefully constructed, the future she had felt so entitled to, had been destroyed. And she had no one to blame but herself. She had thrown a stone at a woman she thought was small and insignificant, only to discover she had thrown it at a mountain, and the resulting avalanche had buried her completely. Months later, the city looked different to Evelyn Brooks. The once intimidating skyscrapers now looked like towers of opportunity. She was enrolled in the top business program at the State University, her tuition and expenses fully covered by the Carter Innovations New Horizons Scholarship, a program founded in her name. Twice a week, she would take the train downtown to the Carter Innovations Tower, not as a cater waiter, but as a mentee. Danielle Carter had taken a personal interest in her, guiding her, challenging her, and teaching her the lessons she had learned on her own long journey. She saw in Evelyn a spark of the same integrity and quiet strength that had defined her own life. Danielle never spoke of the wedding again, but her actions spoke volumes. She was investing in Evelyn the way she had once intended to invest in Blue Thread AI, but this investment felt far more valuable, far more real. The most important asset a company has isn't its technology or its capital, Danielle told her one afternoon as they looked out over the city from her corner office. It's its people, and more than that, it's their character. You can teach someone skills, but you can't teach them integrity. They either have it or they don't. Danielle's own company continued to thrive. A few months after the Blue Thread debacle, Carter Innovations announced a new, even larger investment. This time, it was in a small, innovative startup led by a diverse team of young engineers, two of whom were women of color. The press release made a special point of praising the company's commitment to an ethical and inclusive workplace culture. The message was clear. Danielle Carter didn't just talk about values. She put her money where her mouth was. She continued her life's mission, seeking out and backing leaders who led with character, not ego. She knew better than anyone that real strength wasn't about loud displays of dominance or expensive shows of wealth. It was quieter, deeper, and far more powerful. Power doesn't always wear a crown or a designer dress. Sometimes it wears humility. Sometimes it comes in a simple navy dress, quietly observing, waiting. And when arrogance meets true, unshakable dignity, arrogance always loses. Treat everyone with respect, because you never know who's watching, and you never know who holds the real power. If this story about dignity and justice moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories like this one. What would you have done in this situation? Let us know below.